back now to our top story in Afghanistan, where the effort to evacuate Americans has intensified now that Kabul's airport is back up and running. Afghan aides and interpreters who helped the U.S. military during the two-decade war are also wondering about their fate as the Taliban seizes control. For the latest on the situation in Afghanistan, I want to bring in David Martin. Good morning, David. Please tell us about the latest on the effort to evacuate Americans and Afghan partners from Kabul.
Well, I was told this morning that flights are now running on schedule, and what that means is combat troops in, evacuees get on those very same planes and fly out. And that's a huge difference from when we talked yesterday morning when the airfield was closed because it was being overrun by panicked Afghan citizens trying to get on those flights. The airport had to remain closed until U.S. troops could maintain some security, which consists of putting up concertina wire around the perimeter and then having troops to back it up. And just how chaotic it was yesterday, one, you can see from the pictures you're looking at, but two, one of the planes, when it made its first stop after leaving Afghanistan, it had human remains in its wheel well for its landing gear. So someone had been so desperate to get out as to crawl into that wheel hole, hoping it would be a ticket to safety. And of course, once the plane got to altitude, it was a death trap.
That's tragic. And as you mentioned yesterday, that's a similar story to what we saw happening in Saigon back in 1975, where people being crushed as they tried to escape. President Biden said the Afghani government and military shoulder part of the blame for the current situation. Here's some of what the president said yesterday.
If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
David, has there been any reaction among Afghans or U.S. military personnel to that speech yesterday?
Well, I haven't heard any to the speech, but to the point of the Afghans failing here. Defense Secretary Osman likes to say you can't teach leadership, you can't teach will. So all this training that the U.S. did was in tactics and the rudiments of how you shoot your weapon and all that. But when it comes down to what really makes a fighting force, which is their will to fight and their leadership, they had none. I think it's fair to put that onus primarily on the Afghan forces. But remember, the U.S. for years and years and years was embedded with these Afghan forces. They must have had some sense of whether these troops were going to fight or not, whether they were well led. And of course, everything we know is that they were not well led. It's a very corrupt system. It's not because the Afghans are necessarily bad people. It's just that that's what you do to survive when you're living in a war that's in a country that's known 4 decades of war. So you're a soldier out there in the provinces. Who are you supposed to fight and die for? A corrupt commander, a corrupt province chief, the corrupt government in Kabul? I think they voted with their feet.
I'm wondering, what is the morale like for the current service members in Afghanistan and the veterans who fought there to see it implode like this?
Well, I think it's profoundly dispiriting for everyone who has made an effort in Kabul and in Afghanistan. I mean, the lucky ones or ones who simply did repeated tours there, away from family for years, but who came home in one piece, both physically and mentally. But there are so many, of course, who didn't come home in one piece. I mean, we know the numbers: 2,400 dead, 22,000 wounded, and incidentally, some of those wounds are just extraordinarily grievous, including quadruple amputees. But there's also this thing called moral injury. Just the fact that you were in Afghanistan in this close combat month after month after month has really just done damage to the human beings who did it. And you read about units who came back from some of the worst fighting in Afghanistan, and they suffer more casualties once they get home from suicide, drug overdoses, motorcycle crashes, all that kind of sort of what you would call careless behavior, which is just no doubt a function of the degree to which they were traumatized by the war.
Our thoughts are certainly with those who are experiencing some form of PTSD and for the families of the fallen. David, thank you.
Sure thing.
And ahead, Ed O'Keefe will join us from the White